focusing on privacy. We're recording this, by the way. We'll be focusing on privacy for that event, Joanne DeVoris and Jeff Smith. That'll be June the 18th. I do want to kind of reserve and so confirm that, but we'll confirm that through the normal channels, but we're nearly there with the arrangements for that one. So first today, second one is the privacy event, and then we have a third one lined up as well, details to be announced. Finally, in terms of positioning what we're doing today, I want to just say at the beginning that in a sense there's at least four disciplines behind the thinking here. We've been talking from artificial intelligence and the world that's developing there. We all know about it, we're all involved in it. And have you ever thought, are there historical precedents of an invention being so quickly disowned by its inventors? I wonder about that. I don't know the answer, but have we ever had such a Frankensteinian moment where an invention has been so quickly disowned by its owners as AI? Information systems research for some time has been telling the world moving data into information is not so simple. Moving data into information is a highly subjective, intersubjective process, and it's incredibly complex, and it puts cost and difficulty, debate, misunderstanding into systems. So I'm just counting AI, maybe computer science, AI, information systems research, economics, low transaction costs. Low transaction costs means that with the new internet architectures, with the digital economy, we're doing many good things, and we're also handing power and facility to interests that might be disturbing society in various different ways. And finally, a point about media studies and the idea of information structures influencing the structure then of politics and culture further downstream, kind of upstream, downstream metaphor. The only point I'm trying to make here at this beginning is just to say this is interdisciplinary. Cybernetics is integrative across these different positions, and we're putting a lot of complex material out there. That's it for me, really, other than to finally say that I want to sort of slightly differentiate us from cybersecurity. Cybersecurity, in a sense, goes with the idea that if we only had secure systems, all would be well. But the malignancy that we're invoking today is basically saying we can have the secure systems and that will be a good thing. But the malignancy will still exist. Thank you so much. And with that, I think we're going over to John Roscoe. So Jonathan, you are next. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. There's a bit of background noise has just started. I don't know if that sounds better. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. I'll get started then. So thank you for having me. I'm Jonathan Roscoe. I'm from BT, and I'm going to talk a bit about AI, my perspective of it, how we're using it within BT, with a particular emphasis on a project we've got called Odin, which is around how we can conduct red teaming and the role that that plays within improving our cyber defense posture. Lots I can talk about on this subject. Limited time today, so any questions, my email address is there. Do follow up, and always keen to discuss in more detail. So just to give you some more context on who BT is, because most people think of us as the telephone company and you hate us because your broadband's slow or whatever it may be. But if you're not aware, you know, we're the UK's biggest telco, but we have a global reach. If you've ever used the internet, you've probably at some point touched a BT network in some way. What that means is that we have a lot of people trying to abuse our networks. We have a lot of our customers are victims of sophisticated cyber attacks. So cybersecurity for us is fundamentally a critical aspect of protecting national infrastructure, protecting the UK, protecting customers globally, and as well as our quite significant corporate estate as well. So we do a lot of research and investment into building up new tools, bringing the best to market, as well as taking advantage of our privileged position being an ISP, knowing when an attack is being conducted, that we can analyze that we can get a view of what's going on. So we collaborate across government with other telcos, with customers and so on to really provide critical national cyber defense capabilities. And logically, as everyone is doing now, and to be honest, we've been doing it for a very long time. So BT's AI credentials go back to the 70s, and we've got a very large portfolio of innovation that's been around for decades. Within Europe, we're one of the leaders in AI innovation, and not a lot of people know that, so I always like to drop that in. But everyone is looking to see where they can use AI, and for us, cyber defense is one of the key critical areas that we're looking at. The problem with talk about AI is I think people disagree on what AI is. When I talk to salespeople and data scientists and all, you can get into different arguments, different people. So to start with, I'll take a definition I like, and I like it because it's really broad. It's from the Defense AI Strategy, and it says that AI is a family of general purpose technologies, any of which may enable machines to perform tasks that would traditionally require human or biological intelligence, especially when the machines learn. Now, to me, that doesn't restrict AI to LLMs and ChatGPT type models, but it refers to a whole array of potential data science techniques. My own background is in computer vision, and there's a large number of things that I have done in the past and do currently that I think would knock the socks off some AI, but it doesn't fall under the category of, say, an LLM. So there's a lot of technology out there that I think can be brought in under the remit of AI. But what is it that's kind of changed the trends with AI recently? A good example I like to use is this generation of synthetic data, in particular using GANs, generative adversarial networks, to generate faces. This is something that if we look sort of 10 years ago, you could create a facsimile of a blurry passport photo, relatively straightforward. But we've had this growth in data, this growth in processing power and new techniques, many of which are based on old techniques. And we're seeing massive improvements. This image is 2017. I really should update this slide. But you can see the stark contrast and why people are getting so excited about this technology. And I'm not going to dive into too much detail about the best way to generate synthetic data or which model is best, things like that. But I just wanted to emphasize how quickly this is changing and the sorts of changes we've seen over the last decade. And research into AI did not happen or did not start a couple of years ago. It has been going for a long time. It's just been massively accelerated in the past few years. Now, one of the things I like to do, and if I had more time, I'd really dive into it, but I want to mention it briefly, and we are talking about sort of malign use and some of the pitfalls of AI. And personally, as someone who quite likes AI, I love picking apart AI stuff. I love questioning the hype, the marketing buzz, and looking at what are the negatives and things like that. So I like this example where I've asked AI to generate these pictures of a pig flying over a couple of landmarks. And if you look at the one on the left, I think everyone will agree that it is what it looks like. It is a pig flying over Big Ben. And it takes you a second to realize that it's not actually a real image. There are small errors in this, such as the appearance of the numerals on Big Ben, the fact that there's a river running here where there should be a road and some gardens and things like that. This one with Sydney Opera House, I actually have never been to Sydney. I looked at some Google images. It took me a while actually to check the skyline and identify some of the differences. Otherwise, I might have believed that was a real image. And these two images were generated a few months apart using different versions of the same model. The reason why I like pointing this out is it's very obviously fake. But the problem is we're relying on AI more and more in use cases. So I've seen examples, for example, where someone said, generate me an Nginx config to create a secure TLS endpoint, and it produces a nice working piece of code. But then you notice that actually it's got the wrong TLS version in, and unless you have sufficient background knowledge to identify that a particular wrong version of a cipher has been used, that can be really dangerous and introduce vulnerability. So although it saved that time in generating that code, it still relies on critical knowledge to assess. And for me, the point is that we have to be careful where and how we apply AI and make sure we have the right safeguards in place, and aren't just deploying it, willy-nilly, but make sure that we firstly test them, but also that we're using it to the right degree. And there are a few stories and examples I always like to bring up of kind of the pitfalls of AI. So as a computer vision scientist, one of the sort of main stories we're told as postgrads is the story of the tank detection. So some government scientists were tasked with creating a camera system that could identify when there were tanks in the battlefield. So they go out one day and they take a load of pictures of different tanks in different fields, and excellent, good data set. They go out the next day, they take a load of pictures of empty fields with no tanks in them. Nice, they've got tanks, no tanks, seems like a good data set. And when they train their classifier, it works perfectly every time, excellent. But then they start trying to use it in the wild, and they give it new images, and the results are just random, and they can't understand why until they go back and look at the data and realize that on the day they took pictures of tanks, it was sunny, and on the day they took pictures of the empty fields, it was cloudy and overcast. So what they'd really built was a weather detector, and it's understanding the implication of the data that you have and what happens. We've seen other examples of that as well. For example, in detection of malignant skin lesions. Often with these data sets, there'll be a bunch of images with different samples like this. But if a physician is particularly concerned about the appearance of a piece of skin, they'll often add a ruler for measurement. So malignant ones are more likely to have a ruler in. So classifiers will detect the ruler rather than any indicators of malignancy based on shape. And similarly, there's silly things like this. We've seen with Siri. Siri, I'm bleeding really bad. Can you call me an ambulance? And okay, I'll call you an ambulance from now on. So there are lots of things I think we shouldn't be scared of or worried about, but we should be cognizant that they are potential pitfalls that we need to address. Similarly, I think there are other concerns that are much broader. I'm not an expert on. I would hate to discuss many of these in detail, but I do find them very interesting, and we need to take them into account. The big one for me is hype. There's a lot of hype there. Everyone's trying to sell me a bit of AI these days, and it's just I don't always know what people are trying to get out of incorporating AI, and I think doing things the correct way, where it actually makes value, is one of the big challenges, and I do worry that sometimes it's overhyped to the point that we'll see things not come to fruition in the correct way, and that will harm the potential areas where AI is really valuable. There's also a lot of burden, I think, with getting data. A lot of data is very sensitive for various reasons. It can be very difficult, particularly with those more obscure use cases, to have sufficient training data sets, but we know how important that data is. There's also things like transparency and trust. We've seen with some models from some sources how they're not as trustworthy, or they're biased, and other things, and that's a big challenge. On that, the reason why I've got a picture of this dog here is because I do think that we do employ things we don't trust and understand fully in different ways. And an example of that is with dogs on the battlefield. We don't know what they're thinking, but we know that we can build up a relationship, build up understanding and expectation of how they will react. And that's, to be honest, the same with people as well. Then there's legislation, privacy and security ethics, and the potential abuse. And I'll talk a bit about the abuse in a second. But I think a key thing is that we really want AI. I don't always know what that AI that people want is, but everyone wants it, and for good reason. We can see it's superior to humans in a number of tasks. It makes it a lot easier for people to get work done. They're more productive. It saves time. We can take advantage of knowledge bases that would take humans years and years to absorb. And we've seen these demonstrated in various games. We've also seen the AI operate at scale and fatigue. I see a number of stories where someone's left a model running overnight to generate an output, and they come in the next morning. You can't do that with a human. You can, but you shouldn't. And we're also using I mentioned with BT, we've been using AI machine learning techniques for decades on analyzing vast amounts of data that no human would be able to keep up with. So this scrolling block on the right is net flow data, and it's essentially showing packets traveling between different machines. And there's no way that a human can sit there, look at that, and make sense of that. I'd love it to be like in the Matrix, where you can just stare at a flowing screen of green code and see what's there. But we're using AI techniques to understand all that. The flip side to AI being really effective for the things that we want to do is that other people want to do it too, and the adversarial use of AI is growing and growing. So vulnerability discovery is something that we're already doing as software engineers to help secure our code. We're using AI to detect either it's static or dynamic analysis of code and identify where there may be problems. But if you're using open source libraries, for example, they can be targeted by adversaries using AI to, at scale, detect vulnerabilities. Similarly, spear phishing is a really common one that we've seen. So being able to create quite sophisticated spear phishing campaigns, and phishing campaigns are normally quite they're a very low threshold for complexity. They just rely on hitting a large number of potential victims, and that a small number will actually fall for it. But with spear phishing, attacks are getting much more sophisticated, and traditionally that has involved a lot of research, a lot of work by those behind the campaigns. But now with AI, they're able to automate a lot of that process and improve the types of phishing they're doing, putting out higher quality spear phishing material at scale. Similarly with propagation, identifying new ways to work around the detections that we have for malicious activity on network, and again working at different timescales and non-human speed in order to bypass detections and things like that we have in our networks. Similarly, obfuscation, so creating more complex bits of code that are harder to detect. And destructive power, we've seen payloads target specific systems and not reveal themselves until they're able to make the greatest damage. And we see more and more the use of generative AI, so quite common models like Claude. We've now seen on honeypots the error messages and things from the chat interfaces actually end up being inserted into honeypots, where they have run out of things like licensing terms, or where they've put in an error in a query or something like that. We are seeing those appear in honeypots now, so they are being used by malicious actors at scale. And so I want to talk about how we can kind of flip what we've done traditionally with AI. AI in cyber defense has always been about the defense. How can we detect threats, and how can we respond to them more quickly? But one of the projects we're looking at is how can we do more red teaming, and there's this interesting example from The Verge from a couple of years ago, where they took a generative AI model and they actually flipped it. So rather than telling it to, there's a scoring function that tells it to reduce the toxicity of something, reverse it and see if it can generate things that are actually harmful. And this is for chemical weapons. But this is exactly what we're also doing in cyber as well. And what was scary about this article is that it was producing extremely toxic chemical components that could be used for all sorts of things, and extremely easily. So the question is, can we do the same thing but for cyber? And the advantage with cyber is that we can actually, because everything's software based, we can test things in the real world at a much greater scale as well. So let me tell you a bit about a technique called reinforcement learning. It was popularized by OpenAI in 2020, and they demonstrated its use in hide and seek. And reinforcement learning simply provides a software agent with a reward in response to accomplishing some goal. I like to liken it to training a dog, for example. If you throw a stick and the dog brings it back, you give it a treat, and you keep doing that, and eventually it associates that bringing a stick gets me a treat. Very basic level, that's how it works. It can be more complicated than that. You've got to observe the environment. You've got to take into account different actions that you may be able to do depending on that environment and how you interface with that. But OpenAI produced this red-blue team example, and they did that with hide and seek. So there's a good video on YouTube that you can watch, but I'll show you just a clip now. Hopefully it streams all right. But these red and blue agents, the red ones are the seekers and blue ones are hiders, had this small constrained environment where they could run away, hide. They could use blocks to block a doorway, stop the red agents coming through. The red agents had ramps. And over time, they developed different strategies and ways to cope with the challenge of being seen. So the red agents were trying to find as quickly as possible. The blue ones were trying to hide as long as possible. And this is a very basic example of how the technology works. And you can change the environment, you can provide different properties. And what's interesting is these agents have not been told how to do things. They've only been told either find the other team as quickly as you can or hide for as long as you can. And you can move these boxes, you can lock them into place, you can move around. That's it. What they're doing, their strategy of building up a little defensive wall or hiding bits of the environment, things like that, that's all stuff that's learned entirely, and including this behavior where they're learning to surf along the boxes and the different things that the agent's doing. And what was interesting is that the AI started to exploit shortcomings in the graphics system and the simulation, allowing it to do things that the developers never realized was possible. And that's a really common thing in reinforcement learning. Actually, they do tend to cheat quite often. So let me show you how that applies to the cyber world with Odin. This is a project that we undertook as part of ARCD, the Autonomous Resilient Cyber Defense project, which is a DSTL project with Fraser Nash. And we had here red and blue agents. The red agents simply had to spread across the network. They had a number of actions they could take, including network discovery, system discovery, and exploiting vulnerabilities that it found through those discovery actions. It could also choose to be stealthy, fast. It could choose to do maximal damage, or to go for a specific key target. So there's different motivations that adversaries have based on their back. Are they after financial gain? Are they trying to destroy a system? And there's a whole study into APT activity that we can go into another time that drives those motivations. But the point was to create an agent that could do different things. At the same time, we have the blue team. So the blue team are able to take defensive actions. They can install patches. They can isolate machines from the network. They can reset systems, things like that. And the reason why we're interested in having this red team, and the goal here, by the way, is to create the most effective red team we can, because the stronger our adversary is, the better we can train and practice against it. It's about playing a game with a player stronger than yourself, so that you can improve the outcomes of your own play. And this is what the tool looks like. So this is a visualization of a network, and it's fairly typical. There's a number of different routers with their own sort of bits of connectivity going on amongst them and different protocols. And we can monitor the health of the network. So health can mean a number of things depending on context. It may be that if your network is infected, you actually want it to run regardless and allow that infection to run rampant, as long as it's not shutting down your machines because you're running something important like life support, for example. But then there may be a scenario where you want to shut everything down because your data is so sensitive it mustn't get out. So there's different things as to what network health may mean depending on the use case. And our tool, which is called Inflame, allows you to configure that in different ways. You can look at things like the availability and the confidentiality of your data, and you can model things. So what's happening as this video progresses is steps are being suggested by the AI, and they're being taken, and it is gradually reducing the network health, but it is running several simulations at a time, or hundreds of simulations at a time, to see what happens if I do this or that or that or that, and comparing the outcome of different actions in order to determine what the most effective choice is. And the advantage of reinforcement learning is that you can do hundreds of thousands of iterations in a very short period of time. So as soon as you become aware of a breach on your network, you can do a very rapid analysis of what is the worst possible scenario here, what may happen, and then take action to mitigate that. But the interesting thing for me about this is the way reinforcement learning agents learn. So this is visualization of the red agent, and we run these agents for hundreds of thousands of cycles. In fact, as we increase the action space, which is the number of different things the agents can do, we're actually approaching, I think 2.5 million is sort of standard for our training now. But to give you an example of how it works, we don't tell the red agents how to attack a system. What we do is tell it, you can scan the network, you can scan a host, you can exploit a vulnerability, you can move a file, that kind of thing. And then we just let it do what it wants, and it figures out if that's good or not. So what you're seeing here in the chart is a valid action is something that firstly makes sense because they have the knowledge to do it, and it helps them progress their goal to compromising the network. An invalid action, which is one that either doesn't make sense because they're trying to do something like they're just making a random guess, or they're trying to do something that they shouldn't be able to do because they don't have that knowledge yet, or a repeated action, which is something that it's kind of valid, but it's pointless to do because they've already done it. And what happens when this starts is after no training, they will make mostly invalid actions. They will never reach the goal of compromising the network. They will just endlessly make invalid actions. Occasionally, they'll do something random that makes sense and is right, but for the most part, they'll be invalid. And then after 100,000 episodes, what we start to see is actually it is making valid actions quite consistently. It makes a few mistakes, it makes a few repetitions, but it manages to reach its goal of infecting a target node. And then after 200,000 episodes, in half the time, we're now successfully exploiting the network with absolutely minimal errors in its process. So very quickly, these agents are learning to be highly skilled, focused attackers against our networks. And this is really useful because it really helps with our threat awareness. So we've got these AI-driven adversaries. It allows us to do threat analysis on what are the likely attack paths, what are the weaknesses on our networks, and where can we strengthen things. But the other side of this is that whilst we're training these attackers, we're also training our blue agent, so they have those actions to patch nodes and update systems and so on. And that's giving us greater response. So we can now simulate what's the worst case scenario, what action should we take now to prevent that happening, or what action should we take that allows us to continue business continuity without too much damage to our system or without the exfiltration of data and things like that. And it allows analysts to get instant wargaming scenarios and output and learning from that so they can make decisions. And we often talk about human machine teaming, and AI in BT. It's not about replacing people. It's about, we often say, intelligence augmentation. So providing tools to those who have the skills so they can operate more quickly across a broader set of areas, and respond more rapidly. So that's a very quick overview of how we're using AI and our perspective of it. Just to sort of close off, I want to point out that data is really important in what we're doing when it comes to cyber defense and how we train these systems. It's worth understanding that the adversaries are investing a lot of time and money into taking advantage of AI, and we really need to innovate quicker than them and invest more and understand how they're exploiting it. Scale is always a challenge with data, particularly when we're talking about security. There's a lot of sensitivities to be aware of, but we need to be adventurous and we need to explore different operational environments and understand how we can deploy these tools more effectively. So with that, I'll close off and see if there's any questions.
Well, you won't get that chance, Jonathan. I'm going to save the questions until the end.
Oh, apologies.
No, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. I mean, really greatly appreciated, and that's a fabulous start, Jonathan. Lots of interest for us. So thank you. We will next. So that's Dr. Jonathan Roscoe. In case I didn't say that at the beginning, takes some earning those PhDs. So let's acknowledge them. And next is Dr. Doro Townshend. And when you're ready, Honor, I think we'll carry on. And after that, we'll be taking a short break, which might mean a comfort break, a piece of toast if you're at home. For us, there'll be a mad coffee dash, but that will only be 5 minutes. So after Honor, coffee dash. But...
Yeah, so Peter's exactly right. We've got a comfort break, so we'll go Honor, Omar, and then we'll have the comfort break at 5:20.
5:20,
yeah. No worries. No. And just to mention, my apologies, because I forgot to mention at the start we're recording. I think you guys realised that when it kicked in and you mentioned it, Peter. But as normal, we'll publish this out on our YouTube channel after the event.
Everybody who knows Cybernetic Society knows that he's more organised than me. It's really not fair. Dr. Honor Doro Townshend, please take this.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, a slightly different kind of insight and approach from me to this topic. So my background is in criminology, and that's how I've ended up looking at online behaviours, specifically around substance use behaviours, whether that's the sale and distribution of drugs online or drug use communities and how they communicate online. So today I'm looking to basically just present a little bit of an overview on that topic. So to introduce as well, a lot of the data that I'm talking about over the coming slides are pulled from a series of past research projects, including from my own thesis, which looked at the role and the language relating to masculinities among men who use image and performance enhancing drugs, things like anabolic steroids, on online forums. But also this is research from a project called COVSAF, which looked at the sale of COVID-19 related products on the darknet during the initial phase of the pandemic. So that was looking at both the products that were available, the vendor profiles, and the marketplace profiles. We did a very similar project looking at the sale of carfentanil on the darknet. Again, trying to see a bit of an overview of what products were available, the vendors, the marketplaces, and the sort of international profile of carfentanil on the darknet. And then lastly, this is pulling data from another project called Digital Pathways to Doping, which was on the surface web, but looking at user experience of supplement use, perceived risks, including dark web purchases of supplements and contaminated substances. So to provide a brief overview of just the landscape of online drug markets. So this is a bit of a statistic, which is just an estimated percentage of online drug sales. It's estimated that online drug sales, 60 to 70% of those are made on the dark web. That's often because a lot of the substances being purchased on there are done so from a wholesale perspective by people who then go on to supply in person. 20 to 30% then are on the surface web. So those are platforms that are just e-commerce platforms. They might be disguised as things like research chemicals, sold on forums, etc. And then finally, social media, which is an increasing marketplace, currently estimated at around 10 to 20% of the online drug sales market. And those are platforms like Instagram, Snapchat, Telegram, etc. But focusing on the dark web, where the majority of those sales take place, then just to provide an overview of the scale of this market in terms of online drug transactions. It's got an estimated value of around 2.4 billion US dollars. That was in 2024. It's very difficult, obviously, to actually quantify the value of the trade ongoing on the dark web in relation to drugs or any other product for sale. But this is just a general estimation, but there's obviously a grey figure involved. One of the key, I suppose, differentiators of the sale of drugs on the dark web is the anonymized nature of it. So through the use of a Tor browser, the private browser with doesn't have any tracking or surveillance or censorship, and the use of cryptocurrencies, this makes the sale of substances even more anonymized than when done in traditional senses. And the drug products that are available include some very high risk substances, including, very strong synthetic opioids like fentanyl and carfentanil. The vendor buyer systems look very similar to what you would expect a sort of surface web e-commerce platform to look like. I put a screenshot on the bottom of the slide there of Abacus Market, which I appreciate is quite small to see on your screens, but basically highlights, that's a bunch of different ads of things for sales. You've got ratings, you've got feedback from purchasers, you have multiple options in which you can pay. So these are very advanced platforms. It's not particularly, coded or anything like that, which I think the majority maybe think is the case if you haven't been on these platforms on the dark web. I certainly did before I spent any time on them. But actually a lot of them look very similar to what you would expect, just purchasing something on Amazon to look like. Including things like they have, official dispute resolution services and guidance on how to do that between purchasers and sellers on these marketplaces. It's also global, so you have buyers and sellers from multiple jurisdictions across the world. However, one of the things that we encountered, particularly when we were looking at the sale of supplementation, was regarding the mislabeling of products. And oftentimes, this is always going to be the case in the drugs market anyway, because of the inability to kind of fact check or product test a lot of your products in the majority of geographic areas, just because of the legal restrictions in place. But particularly, we found quite a lot of instances of even things that are, in the context we were looking in the UK, legal supplementation containing illegal substances, including imaging performance enhancing drugs, which were leading people to be disqualified from various sporting competitions, for instance, in that case, because of the mislabeling of products and incorrect formulations in those products as well. And specifically as well, this poses an issue because the dark web drug market poses an issue because of its adaptability. So the markets quickly relocate after shutdowns. For instance, Alphabet closed down, followed by new platforms very quickly. You can see here as well in the middle graphic, I highlighted this, again, apologies, it's so small, but it says online illicit drug sales growth rates between 2020 and 2024. Just to highlight the sort of consistency of this. And you can see there's a big downwards dive in 2022. And I think that's likely because a large platform called Hydra shut down in April of 2022, which had a really significant growth impact that year. But very quickly that was reinstated, and actually by the following year, online drug sales were up in growth. So even the closing down of a particularly prolific vendor or platform is not something that stops this for a particularly long period of time. So one of the parts of the research that we were looking at doing was profiling these vendors. So we wanted to understand who the vendors were, what it was that they were doing, and if they were sort of specializing or if they were more broad. And what we found, so this was predominantly done in our CovSafe project, which I mentioned was looking at the sale of COVID-19 related products on the dark web. So that was everything from medications, vaccines, fake documentation, relating to COVID travel passes and that kind of thing. And we started looking into the vendor profiles and what other elements and product types they were selling. And the majority of vendors we found dealt with quite a limited product type in terms of the sort of broader umbrellas of things like medications or documentation. Vendors often specialized in things like medications or illicit drugs and medications, and they sold a variety of those product types. Vendors selling high-risk products, so things like carfentanil, often they sold a wider repertoire of products. So we found really broad repertoires, including things like other drugs, but also weapons, protected wildlife, and even human organs being sold by the same people selling these high-risk substances, which I think just really goes to highlight the I suppose the extent of the organised crime networks involved in this sale and trade. And I've presented a couple of profiles pulled from our research paper related to this, where you can see information relating to the vendor name, their location, the product types they were selling, and just the percentages of how much of their portfolio was selling those items. So you can see that there's often a specialization, but there is also a significant breadth of items being sold by people on the dark web too. But moving on to the surface web and what that sale looks like on the surface web. So you often have these kind of semi-legal platforms. They might be online pharmacies, or look like online pharmacies rather, e-commerce sites again, might be forums. And oftentimes when drugs are sold on these platforms, they are under disguised listings. So they might be marketed as things like research chemicals, or called herbal blends, or they'll have the label on them, not for human consumption. Though obviously the purpose of them for the buyer is very much human consumption. But this is kind of little loopholes that are utilized, and less so in the UK in the last 10 years or so, because we had a bit of legislation change in 2016 with the Psychoactive Substance Act, which definitely changed this space and what this looked like. If you might remember, before then in the UK, you could go into local corner shops and buy what were called at the time legal highs. And a lot of these products were legal highs at the time, and were also being sold online. This is happening less now, but is still very much a marketplace that is ongoing. Payment methods much less anonymous than on the dark net, so people just using credit cards, PayPal, bank transfers as usual, rather than any sort of encrypted currencies. And like I said, the product range, often it's legal loophole substances, things like synthetic cannabinoids, prescription drugs as well that are being sold for misuse. But from a law enforcement perspective, the reason this platform of drug sales on the surface web is so complex is that it's harder to track because of legal grey areas, because what's happening is people are selling on the surface web, but from various jurisdictions that have very different legislations relating to various substances. So like I said, in the UK, prior to 2016, things like legal highs were very accessible. There are still many countries across the world where that is still the case, so they're able to advertise quite openly on the surface web. And then it's being sold to countries where those substances are not legal, but it can become quite complicated to track that from a law enforcement perspective. And the consumer risks are incredibly high, again, with mislabeled products like we see on the dark web, unknown purities. These items are often, like I said, being sold not for human consumption for a reason, that they're not safe or tested for human consumption. So there's significant risks involved too. And I've put a couple of pictures just of examples of things that have been purchased on the surface web. And then social media. So this was the third sort of avenue I talked about in terms of broad areas online that substances are being sold and advertised. Social media is a pretty significant one. Like I said, platforms, everything from Instagram, Snapchat, Telegram, Discord, etc. And one of the sort of novel features of this is that this is often sold through like coded language and emojis, which is done less so on the dark web because there's not so much of a necessity to. But platforms obviously like Instagram have got blocks in place in terms of being able to use actual drug language. And so instead slang terms or emojis are utilized. This often is a kind of direct sale. It's actually kind of quite similar to a traditional drug dealing model. It's just that traditional drug dealers now do this online to have a slightly broader access of potential customers, but often so it's still done as a predominantly as an advertising avenue to then translate to in-person sale and deal of substances. And it utilizes things like, encrypted messaging platforms, disappearing messages, which is increasingly available, I think, recently on WhatsApp. That used to be like just a Snapchat thing, but as privacy becomes more ingrained in our social media, that's also being utilized for the sale of illicit substances. Like I said, yeah, vendors wise, it's predominantly traditional dealers who are now just utilizing social media. But also one thing that I think is quite interesting anyway is to go back to the sale of image and performance enhancing drugs. Actually, the role of influencers in promoting the use of substances, things like anabolic steroids, which are a category C drug in the UK, meaning that they are legal for personal consumption, but not for sale and distribution. And so what you have is online fitness influencers who talk about their own personal use of these substances because it's not illegal. And actually that feeds into other people who then utilize these apps to sell these same substances to other people. Like I said, it kind of translates to local dealing. There's lots of geotagged posts, various meetup deals, etc., rather than relying on postal services. And similarly to the other kind of platforms, there's a real rapid adaptation. If bans get closed down by platforms like Instagram and TikTok, they can just create another one very quickly by setting up a new email address, and it's of no particular problem to find that same clientele. And this one is of particular concern as well because of youth exposure. I put some statistics in at the bottom. It's not from my research, it's from some other research, which suggested that 1 in 4 children who have seen drugs for sale on social media. So it goes to show that it's quite a widespread thing. I don't know about yourselves, but certainly on my own Instagram, whether it's because I research drugs and the algorithm has learned that about me or not, but I get very regular DMs of various substances for sale. So I think this is quite a common practice now, at least of promotion. And then I kind of just alluded to this before, but one thing that I think is particularly insidious about drug sales and online is this kind of online feedback loop that it's creating, where social media and forums kind of promote or highlight various issues that people are facing. And vendors then use the same social media or forums to advertise potential solutions. And they utilize things that are trending on social media to target potential customers. So I've put some examples we've started to see on social media on the screen. So that is, things like fitness influencers, like I said, creating demand around extreme muscle gain, and then drug supply reflecting that through the sale of steroids, peptides, etc. Things like weight loss trending, which is something that's been quite significant in the last couple of years because of the rise of GLP-1 medications, creating a higher demand for rapid fat loss, and the sale then illicit sale of things like semaglutides, insulin, and stimulants to respond to those trends. Another trend was ADHD on TikTok and sort of self-diagnosed ADHD and various other cognitive differences. And that created a demand around people basically looking online to find ways to enhance their focus and their ability to focus. And then that is responded to by people selling drugs through the sale of things like Adderall and modafinil. Also, talk, I think, particularly on TikTok around times of significant music festivals, things like Coachella, which has been going on recently, things like Glastonbury. There's always heightened trends of searches around psychedelia, and specifically in the focus for mental wellness. And then that's utilized by people selling drugs to sell things like psilocybin, LSD, ketamine, etc. There's a quote on the screen there, which is from my PhD thesis, and the quote says, "My next suggestion would be to find a celebrity or some other famous person with the body you want." And that was posted on an online forum. And I just thought really exemplified the fact that these online platforms are creating the problem and then also providing the solution for the problem, or the proposed solution for the problem. And it's kind of this feedback loop that, unless interjected, is just continuous. And poses these other novel risks as well around the kind of potential normalization of drug use to solve various, quote unquote problems or issues, through things like self-optimization. Again, unregulated products, as I've mentioned before, and the inability of people to test products that they're purchasing on these platforms. Harm escalation as well, which is something we see quite often when buyers may shift to riskier substances. For instance, talking about the weight loss trend and the demand for rapid weight loss, with people shifting from purchasing legitimate pharmacy prescribed products like Ozempic and Mounjaro, shifting instead to online unregulated peptides because the price of the legitimate product is expensive, or perhaps they're not eligible for that, which obviously then comes with its own risks when it's an unregulated version of the product. And also, as we always see, there's this real regulatory lag in terms of platforms and law enforcement struggling to police disguised ads and the use of coded language. I know that I've got to wrap up now, so I'll just very briefly touch on, I've kind of talked about it throughout, that this is then kind of creating this real challenge for law and policy in that marketplaces are shifting so significantly and so quickly. There is significant knowledge gaps in policy as well, because there's inconsistent reporting and intelligence sharing between agencies, countries. And like I said, this is very much an international trade. The involvement of organized crime as well is a significant challenge, because these are very sophisticated networks, which can make infiltration very difficult. And finally, as well, technological developments. And basically that every time new technology is developed, it will be utilized often for these nefarious purposes. And so, there are these dual use tech in terms of very legitimate tools being created that are then repurposed for illicit activities. For instance, as we've seen with things like 3D printing and being utilized to create, unmarked weapons through 3D printing. But I did want to end on a slightly positive note that online platforms, I think, also can be a really key tool for harm reduction in terms of, if we're talking about substances, information sharing as well, and trend monitoring, so we can start to at least understand what trends are influencing what use, and how to access quite difficult to reach communities of people as well. And that is my overview of the state of dark web drug markets. Basically, the online platforms promote and facilitate drug use. Criminal networks exploit those technological advances, the jurisdictional gaps and policy delays, and make illicit online drug trade a growing adaptive challenge for global enforcement. But thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentations.
Thank you, Honor. Thank you so much. Yeah. That was great. So thank you for your expertise. There's so many ways in which we can raise issues from that, but I'm just going to take my own privilege in mentioning some. So, for example, you mentioned that regulatory lag towards the end of the presentation. And one of the questions I think might be interesting for us to tease out is whether we are prisoners of our own models of regulation, of how we think regulation is performed in the modern world, and whether our models of regulation are fit for purpose now in the world you've described, for example. So, so that's one point that I'll just highlight. And then another one was adaptation. You put it right there, very, very interesting again. And two forms of adaptation, at least, one of which was that the platforms we produce. It's really interesting. It's really low transaction costs. But secondly was the linguistic adaptation. And that's just, it's just that there's another layer of adaptation being expressed through these communities, through these kind of networks. Really fascinating. And then finally, I will just highlight, again, I'm using my own privilege here, but it stopped me when you thought about dispute resolution. So in a sense, all of that's a kind of sophistication that an Airbnb puts in, or a PayPal or something like this, that in a sense we see it on the dark web as well. Dispute resolution. It means that more people will trust the service, more people will then engage. Again, the costs of transacting are reduced. It's just kind of it stopped me to hear that facility was there and presumably routine to some sites.
Yeah, I think there's so much money to be made through the sale and distribution of substances online that those platforms will reinvest that money to make more money. Unfortunately, the classic loop of crime, there's money to be made, then there will be people willing to exploit that. Yeah, I'm beginning to suspect they probably have better UI design than many legitimate sites. But well, thank you for your expertise. That's greatly appreciated, and that was a greatly helpful presentation. Another thing that's greatly helpful is Jonathan Randall, who told me that the coffee break is after Omar.
I was planning for before. Oh no.
Yeah. Omar, please accept my apologies, and over to you. And thank you now, representing St Andrews.
Oh yes. Yeah. So a lot of what I'm going to present here, if I can get up the screen, will be the work I'm doing in St Andrews for my PhD. So in no ways should it be taken as fact, but there should be some leeway to not make it seem as if it's totally fiction. But are people able to see that? How do I get it? Okay, cool. All right, brilliant. Right. So my talk is on secret weapons for silent wars. It sounds very scary, and it is. And I'm here to shock, but I'm also here to suggest that cybernetics may have some answers to these shocks that are happening every day in the security field, whether it's in policing, all the way to counterinsurgency, anti-terrorism, etc., etc. So I want to start here for a good 2-3 minutes, and I'm very conscious of the time, on what we mean when we say complex systems, complexity, and also the words we try to use and say to solve it when we say resilience, adaptability. In the military sphere, we have this tendency to proclaim that the world is becoming more complex and that there are certain characteristics that come along with this. But it's not really very clear. And there's a lot of differences between disciplines on how they use the term complexity, complex systems, and the challenges that come with it. But to give a simplest example, and I hope this rounds up the previous and the upcoming presentations on what we mean by a network, what we mean by interactions, and what we mean by some other terms that are typically associated with it. And to briefly put it, very briefly, a complex system is just a number of components, in our case human beings, whose interactions are non-linear and based on local rules. And just stopping there and taking with the previous presentation, individuals wanting or selling drugs Nobody's commanding them. They're not part of a major organization, but a network where each individual in that network, let's say, wants money or drugs. But within that want of these individual components, what ends up happening is you get a number of characteristics, one being non-linear. An example of that would be when individuals are interacting in a problem space, in a security area, a counterinsurgency, or online right-wing or left-wing forums. There's very little ability to claim that there is a cause and effect. And instead, there are millions of people interacting with each other in ways that are very different to how they interacted previously. At one scale, at least, at the lowest scale. Someone wants to buy drugs because they feel depressed. Someone wants to become a terrorist because they're angry. But those individual histories, needs, and subjective experiences lead to interactions between individuals that cannot be calculated very easily. But what happens when you have many people doing that is you get emergent patterns or properties that are beyond the sum of every individual involved. A great example would be insurgencies. Every insurgent has their own need or want and how and why they do things they do. But if you look at a larger scale, you see something emerging, what we call the insurgency or the security space or the problem space. So there are different layers to complex systems, and sometimes we may get confused about which layer we're talking about. And they're dynamic and ever-changing, where in a security environment, those individuals are adapting to changes between themselves, in themselves, between each other, and between different scales, different organizations, international ideologies, local issues that may arise. And so this network of interactions at multiple scales is what we call a complex system. Typical examples can include the human body, the financial system, social movements, societies, online media, we've touched on, financial networks, we've also touched on. But between the crevices of networks of interactions that human beings do, you don't necessarily get something that is separate from normal daily interactions in society. They are a part of, a product of, a result of, or a labeling that we choose to put by saying they're cartels or criminals. An example of that is if you have a normal financial network and a criminal financial network, the only difference is how we label it. In some places, some financial acts may be criminal and others not. But the point is that they all have very similar characteristics. And I've labeled that on the right side with the sources, which I can share later. But these are some of the points made in military and security when we're trying to describe this phenomenon called complexity or complex systems. And we'll get to the differences between the two, or supposed differences between complexity and complex systems. But for now, these are some of the typical characteristics we like to hear about. And this is very important, very, very important. I would probably because I'm only studying it, the most important topic of investigation right now. Why? Because complexity is rising. And here I'll make the delineation between what is meant by complexity and complex systems. But the importance is that it is rising, and these characteristics are very different to how we typically expect the operating environment to be. In the past, security, or the lack of it, would typically and correctly be assumed to come from another organization, another military, or another group, organized hierarchically, who wants something that we have. That doesn't apply as much anymore, and increasingly less so, because they are no longer a hierarchy. They no longer abide by the same characteristics that we expect from a hierarchy. But especially that those, at times, individuals that make up or compose of that complex system that we don't like very much, they themselves may not know what's going on either. It's a very typical example now, where a great example is an insurgent network, but also online forums, is that no one person knows everything going on. There is just too much information. but the individuals are acting with themselves and each other, and that creates the phenomenon we like to call an insurgency or a terrorist network or a drug gang. But they, within themselves, do not have a formal hierarchical structure, typically, but they're a network of influences that create characteristics that are very, very difficult. Just to quickly read out the quote, I really like this. The history of civilization can be characterized through the progressive appearance of collective behaviors of larger groups of human beings of greater complexity. We hear the word complexity a lot. What that simply means in one respect is that there are many behaviors happening at different scales. Because of technology and because of communication systems, I can now have knowledge of anything going on in the world, any book ever written. That was impossible 100 years ago. That was extremely impossible 200 years ago. But now, because of the way our civilization is going, we are able to increase individually our complexity, which simply means the possible states we could be in, the possible behaviors we could do, the possible, possibly the justifications we could have for something. But in formal terms, our abilities as individuals has increased, whether a new ideology gives us a new source of behaviors that we can try out, all the way to how technology allows us to do many more things that we couldn't do before. At a larger scale, let's say at the level of civilization, that complexity of behavior is exploding. My personal subjective claim is probably this variety, this complexity, which are both very similar terms, in fact the same, this variety of possible behaviors is probably the root cause of a lot of security, national, local issues that we're facing, where it's not necessarily about the lack of resources or the lack of talent, but the lack of variety to deal with it, where there's a disconnect between what we want and the amount of complexity of behaviors that we're trying to solve. This second form of definition we can put is the increasing number of complex systems, that the two are highly connected, but not the same thing. What we mean by complex systems is in the environment outside our brains or outside our local governments. What used to be very hierarchical organized systems are giving way to these networks with characteristics that are very similar to what we used to, what we discussed previously on here. And so these two types of quote unquote complexity, one being a measure of collective behaviors and another the characteristics of complex systems, is leading us to a situation where at the individual level, an individual human being can no longer cope with either types of phenomena, where we're at the point an individual in, let's say, the ancient Egyptian times, a pharaoh, would know exactly what's going on in their whole nation. Why? Because if I'm able to zoom in, everyone would act, their behaviors, right, their complexity would be equal or less to the pharaoh themselves, a highly organized and highly hierarchical organization. You couldn't probably breathe without the direct permission of the pharaoh. That has given way to what we call the network, or many complex systems interacting with each other, where depending on the scale you're looking at, from the individual or a group, all the way to the complex systems of non-governmental organizations, multinational organizations, transnational terrorist groups, etc., etc. Individual leaders that we so love in the military and policing and in government, a single prime minister, a single general, and a single, commissioner, can no longer handle the complexity of behaviors that they must deal with in their environment. These terrorist networks can exhibit behaviors changing every day, every minute, that even within a single terrorist group, there are probably hundreds or thousands of different modes and methods that they use, instead of what we're used to. A hierarchical military trying to defeat us, 20,000 soldiers doing all the exact same behaviors of marching, attacking, testudo, throwing spears. Now we have a total proliferation. So a few quotes here. Don't need you all to read them. They're a bit detailed, but what my research has found is a similarity in the challenges of increasing complexity and increasing number of complex systems, to the point where it's become the cool thing to say in the military and intelligence establishment, to the point where a lot of money and a lot of resources is trying to be invested in it. But what ends up usually happening is it's siphoned off by organizations or by national projects who claim that they're going to want resilience and they're going to want the ability to be adaptable. But before we move on to that, I do want to stick here for a second and just have in your minds how, regardless of the field we're in when it comes to security, we're all talking about the same thing. We're all talking about the same challenges, and we're all coming towards, I think will be noticed a bit later on in the next presentation, similar things to think about when trying to be slightly better at dealing with them. But what really catches my mind usually is John Arquilla, late 1990s, predicted the situation we're going to be now in the military sphere. And yet, what I'll get to is cybernetics has been talking about it for many decades. And so Arquilla says, the information revolution is altering the nature of conflict across the spectrum. The reason this is happening is that formerly hierarchical organizations are giving way to the network, with the characteristics that we discussed before. But it also means that whoever masters the network stands to gain the advantage. As we know, in probably most of us here know, in corporations and governments and organizations, material, human power, skill, that's going to get us there. Strong organizations, hierarchical, everyone knows what they do. No. Whoever can master the network will probably end up having a much better advantage, especially if your adversary is a criminal network, terrorist group, etc. So we have here in different fields of the military and security, very interested in what's going on in the world outside them. But what I have found looking through them is a lot of confusion, because what they try to describe is that the world is very complex. There are many characteristics that are going on, but they don't use two tools from cybernetics, two very, very interesting tools from cybernetics and complex science, which is try and think multidimensionally and try and think multi-scale, or at very least what scale we're discussing when we're looking at the complex system or a complex environment. And one way is, for example, complex systems or the complex environment is multidimensional. It's not just military, or it's not just social, it's not just financial. There are innumerable numbers of influences that we can categorize. It can be psychological, need to become a terrorist, for example, or it can be a causal effect that is a bit more obvious. Someone's taken their land, they join a terrorist group to take back their land. And the terrorist group was the only one that provided the material manpower to get it back. But more often than not, it's multidimensional in that multiple influences affect the network, affect the individual nodes and humans in the network, and they're very difficult to untangle. Where we like to create beautiful models of why or how or when or who something happens in a complex system, it can never be the full story, because a model must always reduce the amount of information involved. That's why models are useful. Problem here is complex systems are multi-scale and emergent, which simply means breaking it down for analysis will literally make it impossible to understand why it's emergent and why it's emergent in this way. An example of that is, I always use an example of ants. Human beings understand everything to do with ants. Ants are very simple. They follow simple rules. But those simple rules that they follow in their local environment leads to extremely beautiful and complex collective behaviors, where they're able to manufacture road networks, they're able to fight enemies in a very organized manner. They're able to survive in environments that humans can only dream of, and in the tens of billions. Humans are just the same. Complex systems cannot be reduced by simple models, because there is no one model to capture all the influences going on that affect their local behaviors. I'll leave that there. getting on with time. So we have this situation where complex systems should be thought of as multidimensional and multi-scale. And yet we don't necessarily like to use that in the military or defense sphere. We see this phenomena, we like to label it as all such things, complex, complicated, this and that, non-linear, emergent, and yet it's like all of us are touching us, a type of phenomena where we build major models and ideas on one specific aspect, but then totally ignore the other aspects. And so that's led to a proliferation of military and security theories, some quite old, some newer, some involved at the local tactical level, others at the geostrategic or even policy. Different targets. But what all these theories try to do is to affect the adversary that is assumed to be more complex than usual, different from conventional warfare, that has multiple dimensions and multiple scales. So an example we hear often is hybrid warfare, where the use of multiple methods under the same operation in order to have a unified and emergent effect on the enemy, while blurring the lines between war and peace. Similar is the British adaptation of that, of instead of trying to defend against hybrid warfare, we want to affect other nations with it, other societies. Mosaic warfare is at the operational military level, sensors, shooters, command nodes, system destruction is a Chinese version, etc., etc. The point is, everyone is trying to touch on complexity, complex systems, how to take advantage of it and how to defend against it. But it gets very murky and difficult to understand where people are coming from, because there's no formal science yet of complexity of cybernetics in warfare. And a quote by a historian in the military, Juan Roscoe, who was the first person to document the scientific stages of warfare. With chiropractic, his own term, I hope he makes money with it. So with complexity warfare in its infancy, and military thinkers and practitioners still grappling with the full implications of the non-linear sciences, it is too early to speculate. A recent paper of his is still with that same line. The military and our security establishments have not got it. But we need to, because if we carry on like this, we're going to lose like we did in Iraq, Afghanistan, the wars with the cartels, Russia's initial quite effective attempts in Ukraine, 2014 onwards, and many others. Because what hasn't happened yet is adversaries have not yet either understood what's going on. They might act as a complex system, but that doesn't mean they have a full knowledge of what a complex system is, the theories behind it, etc. And like everyone knew about gravity and the falling apple, but it was Newton that started to formalize and standardize what's going on. But whoever gets that advantage will be ahead of others, in my personal belief. So what I try to do, partly in my research in St Andrews, but also with other places, is how do we as good-minded people defend against or exploit complexity, whether for our policing, whether for the military, intelligence, governments. So secret weapons for silent wars is a bit of a strange child, marriage between management cybernetics and complexity theory, where I try to trace what are the needs that are required in an environment filled with complex systems, i.e. filled with networks that don't have formal organization or formal governance structures. So I don't go much into this because there's not enough time, but the relevance is important, whether it's the Secret Weapons for Silent Wars program or anyone trying to deal with the increasing complexity of the world we live in. Overcoming reductionist limitations, where Robert Laughlin, and I love this one, we're now from the age of reductionism to the age of emergence. Great. Doesn't go on to explain it very much, but others do in cybernetics and in complex science. The point of it, though, is essential, if anyone's ever interested, is that we can no longer use reductionist limitations unless, in order to address the characteristics of complexity. It also means that instead of material, we need to start concentrating on having our own requisite complexity, an environment that has a lot of collective variety and behaviors, we as organizations need to also have that. We need to match the environment according to Ashby's law. I think most of you might have heard that. Facilitating multidimensional strategies and adapting to counterintuitive dynamics, which is a very fun one, where we all like to think, if I put this or I do that, the results will be within a parameter of probability. Unfortunately, that does not work with complex systems, where they can be extremely counterintuitive. A simple example is in Helmand province in 2014, the British Army wanted to build a beautiful clinic and school, and they thought two reactions would happen. One is the locals will not like it because it's Western, but we can manage that. Or two, they love it and we get more popular support. A third thing happened. The whole province, the whole district in the province fell to the Taliban. Because one guy was so jealous about a clinic being built on someone else's land and not his, he decided to pretend that that local clinic and school was a place to recruit British soldiers or something like that. And so the Taliban didn't know what was going on, but they ended up helping this man. The British didn't know what's going on, so they thought the Taliban had taken over from a foreign area that had come in. And that whole place was bombed to bits by both sides. When in reality, it was just the cause of one individual in this network of social influences that caused a catastrophic failure. Things will be counterintuitive as time goes on. Anyways, that would be the end. And I'll give a presentation at this slide. So, yes. Thank you all.
Thank you again, Omar. Thank you for your expertise and for giving us those insights into your research, the research up there at the St. Andrews. And so many things, but just to kind of highlight something. So I think you're the first person to mention Ashby, but yes, but Ashby is present in all of this.
Yes.
I think the early questions we had about regulatory systems, obviously. But there's another image here. I mean, that the last example of the clinic is a great one. Is a great one, but how one point of collapse. Yeah. But one of the things I'll just highlight very quickly is weaponry. Because as well as the progression along the dimensions of, in a sense, information on complex organization, there's also a tooling up with extra kit. You know, in the early civilization, there's the spear, yes, but now the drone. So the capabilities. So as networks form, they are actually also more consequential than the historical fallbacks.
Yes.
Right.
Well, it's interesting because the more technology progresses, the more components that are required, the more training required. What we're seeing is a proliferation of military technologies themselves, where in the past a sword, a weapon, and you'd have an individual. The only time you'd have more than one individual is if it was very large, like a capital. Today, you need hundreds of people just to get a fighter jet flying after 20 hours of flying. We're seeing a proliferation of, even in organizations or the military, anything, the technologies we create also increase the complexity, both of what the individuals have to deal with, managing it, but also the higher you go into the organization to try and take account of everything going on with those technologies. And you just get proliferation that's, at least in the military, becoming unbearable.
And also asymmetric effects.
Yes.
When one side is equipped with fighter jets, the other with drones,
Yeah.
or one with troop carriers, the other with IEDs, and those asymmetric effects. There you go. Thank you. That's hugely informative. I don't want to call your talk more wonderful because, as you set out, you worried us. And thank you so much for that. That's a great contribution. So, Jonathan, we are down to take a short break.
Yes, yeah, I'm just thinking, Peter, it's 26 minutes past now. So shall we give ourselves till 5:35? That just gives enough time for people to get to the toilet, get a drink.
Coffee.
Yeah, great. And also we'll look at one or two technical things in the room. So if you hear things happening over the next few minutes, we're not back, we're just testing one or two bits. So we'll be back at 5:35.
Yeah, resume 5:35. Thank you so much.
Brilliant, thank you. Right.
Okay. So welcome back, everybody.
We're going off laptop mics. We had a bit of feedback from one or two of you guys about the cameras kind of a bit all over the room. So we'll go off laptop mics for this part of the session. So pass it to you to kick off now, Richard.
Great, thank you very much. Can I just have a thumbs up if people can hear me, please? Yeah, we got thumbs up. Yeah, super. Right. Okay, so let's try and add some value to what's already been said. I'm going to talk about security cybernetics, and I'm going to talk about how security, cybernetics, and games theory kind of been woven in historically. And we're kind of at a really interesting point where we can kind of combine these things and start to perhaps deliver some value. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the antecedents. I'm going to talk about Badlands and how we might observe it and consider it. I'm going to talk about Ashby's law. Peter mentioned it just now, and I'm going to try and provide some examples to kind of wrap this whole thing up. So without further ado, and hoping the technology is working, wonderful. So security and cybernetics, some antecedents. There's a definition of security there. It's around human rights, it's around meaningful human existence, and flourishing and environmental flourishing. Really choose whichever description or definition you want, but those are the kinds of principles that we might wish to aspire to. Those are the kinds of things that certainly, if you go to the teachings of Aristotle, we can find some really useful roots. So talking about polis, the body of citizens, or the Greek city-state, in a condition of democratus, democracy, ruled by the people, a constitution, a politia, with separation of powers, the legislative, judicial, and executive separation. At the human level, the self as a system, the idea of eudaimonic existence, so purposeful happiness, and of course, cybernetics, Kubernetes, and the often cited definition from Ashby, the art of steersmanship of this state, involving coordination, regulation, and control. So we've got common roots, I would argue, in terms of security, cybernetics, and games. And if we look at the Greek contribution to games and security, we can see it in the Olympiad. Faster, higher, stronger. The qualities of I think Omar started talking about throwing spears. You know, the warrior who could win the game, very much at a warrior or a tactical level. The idea is the game is zero sum. It's kill or be killed. It still continues that zero sum game if we look at the context of modern warfare. We can't. Sorry. It's automatic. Yeah. Okay. So if we zoom forwards from ancient Greece and we start looking at the roots of the third industrial revolution, the digital revolution, and go to the 1950s, we can start looking at what Ashby would be saying about things. So that is the theory of regulation and the theory of games have much to learn from each other. And for those who notice the picture there, that's AI's version of what might be the first machine learning device, Ashby's homeostat, and it just shows that AI can interpret things in very different ways. But so Ashby recognizing the theory of games very much part of that theory of regulation. And round about the same time, we had Turing writing that seminal paper on computing, machinery, and intelligence, and talking about the imitation game. the imitation by machine of what I think John Roscoe aptly described as biological intelligence. But the other thinking going on, I think, really useful thinking going on at the time, Norbert Wiener, in The Human Use of Human Beings, he describes this great game. This is the great game for the Cold War, military and quasi-military purposes, and particularly this final part of the quotation, the psychological limits the players and especially their fatigability as part of the game itself. So the game moves from one that you win, you kill or be killed, to one where you wear the opponents down in some kind of attritional approach. So let's move on from the 50s, bring it up to the 60s. And Donald Davis, 1966, innovated data packet switching. For me, this is perhaps our historical starting point of a new game. Barely 4 years later, George Mallon develops the Eco Game, this intuitive machine-human interactive technology built for training, utilizing Gordon Pask's ideas of conversation and learning within systems. And if you look at what Mallon's Eco Game ended up doing, it was adopted by the precursor to the World Economic Forum. It was sold to IBM as a training capability, and the projection technology was adopted by Stafford Beer for his work in Chile for President Allende and the whole CyberSyn project. So cybernetics games, that wider definition of security, really contributing from that point, and it's built upon the movement of data and this whole contribution of data packet switching. So that was all good. 1970s, things speed up. Things change. 1990s, Stafford starts talking about the societal information circuits, where data starts to cause a regulatory response by the state in terms of security. He talks about data being toxins, almost a pathological kind of quality or characteristic flowing across these dissipative systems, exchanging energy, which ultimately leave us in a state of entropy. And for entropy, we might consider both noise and uncertainty within systems. Accelerate that forward to the mature and speeding up mobile internet, as Peter said, lowering transaction costs and competitive global markets, rapidly fueling this advancement of data capabilities that are causing our security problems now. And, you know, John Roscoe talked about cyber defense. Honor talked quite fantastically about these recursive drug markets that exist on different electronic platforms, and Omar's whole approach to how complex information, data, and warfare has become. So we're in a really kind of interesting time now. And in 2025, obviously, we're sat here talking about how data can be gained. And I think, I just took some notes here. All of our speakers talked about obfuscation. Obfuscation is a technique in the game. All of our speakers talked about adaptation as a way of staying in the game. The resilient marketplaces that Honor talked about, the resilience in the military situation, the red versus blue resilience through scenario testing that John talked about, the speed of change and the speed of adaptation, and what we might call infinite gaming. So, like systems, games have recursive layers, and we've kind of heard that a number of times today. And this I would call, excuse the pun, but the Game of Thrones. It's a cooperative game, the highest strategic level, discussing, in this case, Ukrainian security. But we can't depend on those games being predictable because the Game of Thrones changes. And this was a new Game of Thrones. And I don't know if you recall the exact words from this clip, but you do not have the cards right now. The reply was, I'm not playing cards. Okay, so for me, really captured the idea of a strategic, competitive game that changed very, very quickly. And of course, we've seen that game change again, iterate again, almost this randomized emergence of this Game of Thrones, which is now returning seemingly to a more cooperative approach. So let's look at Badlands. Badlands is a place where dynamic engagements between asymmetric actors or groups utilize their own emergent and self-defined rules. There are no rules here. You make up your own rules and you play your own game. That we've still got warrior finite games, just like the ancient Greeks, that aggregate into strategic infinite games that excel themselves are unpredictable, as we've seen in the Games of Thrones. Resilience means staying in the game. The game for Ukraine is survival. It's nothing else. The game is survival. Technology and systems generate disturbances. Drug markets, cyber attacks, military technologies that all need countermeasures. So it's a game of measure, countermeasure, measure, countermeasure. And for my research, data variety characteristics determine the level of security stroke insecurity and the varying truths that we as societal systems, in my own previous world in the criminal justice system, need to contend with. For that, we developed something called a data requisite variety framework, the idea that data can be characterized in the way of Ashby, in the way of beer, to really understand how these perturbations actually impact on systems. I haven't got time to go into any great depth with the requisite variety framework, but it's the 9 V's, and you see them there. It's the volume of data, it's the velocity of change in these data, it's the vectors with which these data move across, it's the veracity, the obfuscation, the untruthfulness, it's the validity, it's the provenance, continuity, and validity. Is it telling me what I think it's telling me? It's virtualization. Where are the platforms outside jurisdictions? It's the viscosity. We've talked about ephemerized data, disappearance on WhatsApp. It's the variety of data types that we're needing to deal with. John talked about the wrong TLS being written into code, and it's the vulnerabilities that systems are needing to contend with. So Badlands is this place where data has all these characteristics, which is creating the variety. So within research, we came up with this notion of security cybernetics, and there's a working definition there. It's an infinite game. It's not a game you can win. Of adapting and deploying dynamic capabilities to effectively regulate threats within this proliferating, complex, probabilistic, and ever-changing security landscape. I'll just let you absorb that. Infinite game, adapting and deploying dynamic capabilities, regulating threats within this problematic security landscape. And we come back to Ashby's law. This is my interpretation of Ashby's law. And what we've essentially got there is that the variety of the outcome, or the changes, the dynamic changes of the variety outcome, are a product of the changes in the variety of the disturbance, less the changes in the capabilities that deliver the variety of the response. So Ashby's law, only variety in a system can destroy stroke absorb the variety of demands placed upon that system. If you don't have the right capabilities in place, then you may not be able to absorb the variety, except in the point of asymmetry. If you can't absorb that variety, instabilities can then ensue. So security cybernetics is a non-trivial game. It's an infinite game. Data and information are perturbating our systems. They're creating entropy in systems. Entropy, consider data as an energy cost almost of people and systems, and it can be weaponized as a form of variety disruption. And as I said, the capabilities are needed to deliver the variety response. And we can model the disruption through the requisite variety framework. And what my thesis certainly found is that those 9 Vs are very difficult to characterize. They're meta-complex. They occur in so many different ways and combinations. You've almost got to have a second capability to be able to bespoke a response to those particular disruptions or attacks. So what can we say about purposeful security strategy? I've tried to put the 3 principles there. So promotion of ultra stability, the tendency for resilience, nurturing this kind of mindset almost of and behaviors of infinite homeostasis by using a design focus, not a planning focus, a design focus on playability. Can I play this game is the question for leaders. To anticipate demand, variety, and build variety response. Anticipate demand and build response. That's playability of this cybernetic game of security. And we've heard it said earlier this afternoon, we hear it again now. There's nothing new in this. Some of these giants of cybernetics have already shared such wisdom previously. And this is a lovely quote from Turing, 1950. And I think it's highly relevant to that environment that's being described by everybody this afternoon. We can only see a short distance ahead. We can't see 5 years ahead. We can see a tactical bound or maybe 2 in front of us. But we can see plenty there that needs to be done. Now that changes the way perhaps we look at security strategy. Do we try and predict what we might be facing in a future when in fact we can see that there's enough to deal with the variety we're already facing or foreseeably going to be facing in the very near future? Lovely words. Let's move to some examples. So this is an example taken from the Telegraph last week. It's a data example. Drone, counter drone. The game accelerates, where the disruptive technology in data and the response technology in data are proliferating. And this was an example of radio frequency direct energy weapon systems being able to, or tested and allegedly being able to take down drone swarms. That was not a requirement 18 months, 2 years ago. It was foreseeable, but it wasn't actually a physical requirement. So that's an indication of this acceleration of the game. Really important point there. We can expect subsequent commercialization, and this is where this kind of military technology can then transcend into the wider kind of societal environments through commercialization, of which we have very little stroke no particular control. We lose control. This is another example of possible data variety risk. This was taken from The Guardian this week, around profiling and sharing UK biobank data, where the population is profiled and bad actors in Badlands could utilize these data quite legitimately to plan and consider responses and attacks, or indeed even consider drugs markets, I suppose, in some respects. I thought of that until your presentation, but a really good example of possible non-linear data variety risks. Here's one I got involved in a previous life, and this is commercialized data. And this is about indirect energy weapons, if you want to use that term, obfuscating criminality. So standard GPS jamming, pretty common fare on eBay and open source websites. Faraday pouches to protect your devices. Jamming kits to stop eavesdropping, counter eavesdropping technology. That's on eBay. That's commercialized. That used to be really, really sensitive. The usual stuff, loads of spoofing apps on Play Store, and spoof calling, a great facilitator for volume crime. The map in the background there is GPS jam, which is a daily map of GPS jamming recorded all over the world, and some really interesting data there if you can get into that granularity. So commercialized data that used to be actually quite sensitive techniques is part of that kind of societal need now for security. So how are the responders doing? Well, here's an example from the Inspectorate Constabulary. Police forces are overwhelmed, ineffective when it comes to digital forensics. 25,000 devices sitting on shelves, not seen. If you look at playability and being in the game, the anticipated requirement and the need to build against that requirement were utterly foreseeable through the expansion of mobile internet. Question is, strategically, why were we not adequate in building those capabilities for the game? We can see it in other investigative areas. This one is the anticipation was absolutely right, because it was enshrined in law, but the ability to then build effective capabilities has not subsequently followed. This is something called internet connection records. I actually gave evidence to a public scrutiny committee in Parliament around ICRs for evidence, and they're really, really difficult. They're complex. They're complex because of the nature of networks, which are changing constantly. They're complex because of obfuscation technology now that where customers can increasingly frustrate the collection of ICRs. And that's an independent report from David Anderson QC, who reviewed matters in 2023. I gave evidence in 2015. It's now 2025. You know, there is something about the speed of change that we as society might wish to reflect on. So what is the state of the state? Well, I think we've heard a lot of it this afternoon. So rapid fire, institutions may be stumbling, still deterministic 5-year plans, Cartesian approaches, putting complexity in simple boxes, just doesn't work. Reductionism, this so-called performance management, particularly, is still prevalent in policing. We've seen capability developments are not requisite for the data environment, and struggling narratives. You know, if we're talking about smashing gangs or winning the drugs war, that suggests we're in a zero-sum game. We are, in fact, dealing with an infinite game. You will never win against those scenarios. They're too complex, as Omar quite rightly highlighted. Allostatic loading. Allostasis was adopted from allostatic loading was adopted from cardiology. I found it in my research, and that's essentially where data and systems are being overloaded and too much is being asked of them and chronically becoming pathological. And we're also seeing justice being oscillated by data and variety. So this is a call for evidence from the Ministry of Justice talking about the fallibility of digital evidence for potential miscarriages of justice. Pete and I have just put a response into the MOJ for that. But essentially, this is around how the justice system responds to all of that data variety I talked about and can meaningfully infer evidential value from it. Thank you very much for listening. That was quite a gallop. I think the presentations this afternoon have demonstrated that not only is security complex, but we would also argue, I think, to a person that everybody has a right to security. We think cybernetics can help. The question is, how might we respond in this new game? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Again, just wonderful, Richard. And I think some of the messages I've been picking up, people have been sending me WhatsApp, different messages. And so thanking you for that contribution, Richard, and thanking all of the presenters. So thank you to the audience. We've got a chance now to talk about this. I think that note you struck at the end, Richard, is really important. I mean, like secure, it's low down on the hierarchy of needs, isn't it? We need security. It's low. It's fundamental. If we don't adjust now, we can't supply it in this changed environment. Then, in a sense, who or what are we? You know, I think there's a big moment around this. You know my views. I think we then go back to you, Richard, and some of the questions that have come in already. So if I thank you again and just hand over to you, Rich, is that okay? Makes sense.
Yeah. Do you want me on speaker? No, that's fine. If you pick up, and then if John.
Questions in the room, and we've got questions. Yeah, the questions in the room are quite something.
Not sure if us as the audience are supposed to be able to hear anybody speaking, but I certainly can't.
Regulate. That's one angle of that system. Then what do you do about rewards? I mean, we've got traditional reward and punishment.
No, I can't either.
I'm interested in the way of changing the payoff.
I can hear somebody's voice very, very faintly, but that's all.
Drug system. I talked to a C-suite banker a few years ago who was convinced.
So I can now see the secretary, and I can see them. I can see somebody speaking, but I can't hear it. Very, very quiet. There's something not right.
Control of the drugs money going into them, and I'm using the word banks very widely.
And the other thing is to sort of, we talk about game theory, incredibly important. If you can persuade people that they're in a different game, say if you invent hell, for example, or you give people knighthoods if they don't muck up.
Can't hear at all.
No, me neither still.
It's a define to be defined thing, which extends your possibilities cybernetically.
We've got issues with the audio coming through, so Richard, would you mind summarising the question?
Well, I think it's an observation rather than a question.
So we can't really hear you, Richard.
It's an observation.
No.
And I think what you were talking about.
I'm guessing they can't hear us either.
Can you hear us, Peter? Peter Kay? Looks like not.
I think we had a muting problem there, Ian. We should be okay.
Okay, is that better?
That's better. Now I can just
Oh,
heard
okay.
Richard then.
Sorry about that. So just to reiterate, David made a number of observations, which I'm going to attempt to summarise. And David, please correct me if I've got this wrong. And this was around problem solving and creating what I'll call different approaches to security. Your sheep analogy, I think, is, you know,
It's the easiest thing.
Yeah.
Way in that.
And looking to almost use games theory to alter behaviors that would affect people's security.
Because most games have implicit rules on both sides. If you can look about with people's perception of a criminal.
Yeah, so David's talking about games having implicit rules with the players at the time. I think from what I've gleaned so far from you, David, I think the value of games in regulating security has value that we're not able to properly define at the moment. Would that be a reasonable assessment?
Yeah.
Would that be so that's an agreement. Would that be a worthy task for cyberneticians to pursue?
Yeah, we often always do that.
Okay.
I'm just thinking because the audience can't hear what
Oh,
you're
right.
saying, David. It's really, it's
Okay.
So, Richard, do you want
Can I give you a response to that question and maybe move on?
Yeah.
To
Well, I think
it's just because I can't hear you. Yeah.
I think what we've just discussed, and I do apologise to folks around the audio, is that games theory approaches are not clear within clear enough within cybernetics, but they do offer opportunities to create greater security in certain contexts. David, with that, David's nodding,
Yeah.
and that was his point.
Immune system plays a kind of game all the time in the body, and it has different layers of ways of doing it. And I'm just wondering if getting an immunologist on board to think of the logic of what they understand of how that works, how it's activated, because there's innate and there's adaptive immunity. And there's organ specific, and there's multiple layers with different types of problems. So the solution spaces are different, and the modus operandi is different. So I think there needs to be a lot more texture in your variety engineering. And maybe an immunologist could do that.
So that was a point, just in case the audio hasn't worked. But Margaret came through with the idea of bringing immunology into that consideration to kind of help engineer greater variety in
Adaptive and innate immunity.
Yes, adaptive and innate immunity, and thus create variety responses that we wouldn't have previously. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm getting a steer here from Pete Dudley. So the fields of cybernetics and games theory are just foundations for science of how to get your own way. Paraphrasing Ashby, 1956. That's really interesting, Pete. But what is our own way? Who's this question to? Pete, are you able to?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yeah.
Can we hear Pete? Okay.
I can hear Pete. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
You'll need to go on mute.
I need to go on mute.
Back now. Can you hear me now? No? Can't hear you either. I'm going to give up.
I could hear that. Okay.
Right. Hello, Ian.
I am.
So I forgot where I was at now. Yes, I think there are a couple of things I'm sort of driven to intercede really with the previous speaker. I don't think the game changes. I think if you read Ashby, we're all doing the same thing, which drives out of that. We're trying to get our own way. And if you put that in the context of past learning machines, we're all in the business of learning how to get our own way better. So the challenge is the stuff we wrap around us and what the environment throws at us. I'll stop at that point. So it's more an observation than a question, I guess.
Yeah. When you say own way, Pete, I'm not going to let you off the hook there. What do you mean by getting our own way?
Well, in your context, secure societies, possibly in my context, another pint. The whole point of the exercise is if you go right the way back through this stuff, what it's saying is it's general. It is generally applicable, and it's generally applicable because you apply the same set of rules to different desired outcomes. So when we set up your SimSec or SecSim thing, we're living in an environment that's trying to overcome us, but so are the criminals. So it's exactly the same interchange that's going on between us. And it's the one that learns fastest how to get around the other one that wins locally for this point in time.
Yeah, absolutely. And
To be more careful about, there are things that I think we need to recognize as similar, and there are some new tools that we can derive from that thinking that we can't derive if we make it all unidirectional and or linear. So we need, I think there's a much bigger argument that my internet connection is not going to support this afternoon, Rich. But June, July will be fun. July will be fun. July will be fun.
I look forward to that.
So I'll stop now, and you talk to people that you can hear more clearly, and I'll shut up for the time being.
Okay. Next one is a question for Omar.
Honor, we've got a question for you, please. And it comes from Daniel. Daniel Jonas. Is there any research on the payments methods used? Are these covered under AML / screening provisions?
So this was in respect of the first presentation about the dark web and what gets sold on the dark web.
Yeah, thank you.
Right, so yeah, the payment methods used on the dark web for.
Can't really hear.
No.
I'm mute, Omar.
It's only because yours is also unmuted, and then we're going.
Yeah, we're going to clash. Yeah, I'll kill the audio. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so about the payment methods used. So I mean, what we found so far about how payments are conducted when selling drugs on the dark web is that oftentimes it really varies platform to platform. So some of them have a lot more sort of integrated systems where you utilize your cryptocurrency or your pay safe cards, for instance. And it's kind of set up in a way that looks very like any e-commerce platform. Some of them are more, or I suppose, less organized in that they simply will leave a link to it. For instance, there's an instant messaging app called Wicker that's used quite a lot. It's WIC-R, and it's got high levels of encryption and user privacy and verification on WIC-R. That's something that's used quite a lot, and all they'll provide, rather than actually providing any direct means of payments through things like cryptocurrency, they'll simply provide a WIC-R username. Someone else will download the WIC-R app, contact that person, and then the financial exchange will happen in details that are only presented in that app and are not left in any traceable format on the dark web. So then what they go on to do in terms of how that payment changes hands, I don't know at that point. But what we can see in the majority of transactions do happen through, your cryptocurrencies, things like Bitcoin, which are inherently less traceable than the average ones. When we're talking about the surface web sale of drugs, often those are predominantly exploiting sort of legal loopholes and gray areas. And so they are using more traceable payment systems, but they're not necessarily going to flag up as sort of criminal activity because the nature of the product is in this gray zone. I hope that kind of answers that question.
It kind of does. I mean, is it the sort of thing? I mean,
sorry, I can't hear the response. Hang on.
Hello?
Put it out
Hello?
loud.
Hello?
Sorry,
Hello?
I can hear you now.
Okay. So is it the sort of thing that might be discoverable via a in the same way that, for example, a fraud data overlay would use would identify particular patterns that might be of interest?
Yeah, so I think that is often the case, that if anyone's flagged up on those traceable formats, if they're purchasing on the surface web and using more traceable financial sources, it's often going to be the case that they're apprehended by law enforcement after repeat transactions, or large sums of money because they're, for instance, bulk buying a product of some form to often resell.
Right.
But that only happens at a point when there are repeat transactions. We can all hear me in the room. It's terrible.
Yeah. What we could do, Omar, if you kill your microphone and speak, we'll go back to the owl, because the owl is more appropriate for this kind of interactive. We killed the owl because it was wandering all over the room in the first second.
All right, now I can't hear you at all.
Daniel, you should be able to hear us now?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
In the video.
Okay. So, I mean, I'm just quite interested in who it is does this work and how they interact with the payment system in general. Whether this goes via, for example, through which organizations this goes through. I ask because I run the research department of the National Payments Operator, and this isn't something I come across very often, although the fraud stuff does.
Oh, no, it's interesting. I mean, it's not, I don't know so much, I suppose, about that, the more technical side of how those transactions occur. And also a lot of the data that we collected in our research, so we didn't access the dark web directly. And that was because of basically just the ethical loopholes of trying to get permission to do that through universities. And so what we did is we used essentially a scraper tool, a platform that we instructed to monitor certain keywords on various dark web platforms for us over a prolonged period of time, which meant that even if that platform was then closed, as they often do because it's so ever-changing, it meant that we could still see previous postings, even if that platform is no longer accessible. So it was better for a kind of ethnographic view of any sort of trending data. But what that also means is that we didn't necessarily get the same level of insight into ongoing transactions and what they look like in practice, because we're only able to see the surface of a now defunct platform, if that makes sense.
I guess so. Yeah. So it sounds like a very interesting discussion to have at length, which I'd be happy to do. If,
yeah, I'd
Jonathan
love
wants
to.
put
And
us
I
in
think you'll know
contact.
a lot more about the financial side of things than me, but I'd love to hear your thoughts too.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Honor. We do have a question, please, for John Roscoe. Technology permitting, of course. And it's from Pete again, technology permitting. And it's around the agents and the permitted activities, Pete. And I presume this is in the AI gaming process that was described. Is there anything else, Pete, that you'd like to say in respect of that?
You're on mute, Pete.
I don't actually see his name in the list unless I'm missing it. But
Yeah, I think he's gone.
but I'm happy to elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, if you would, please, John.
I'll confess I don't know Ashby in a lot of detail, but I mean on the topic of the what we call the action space within reinforcement learning, yes. So we define currently, that's the caveat. We define what that action space is. Reinforcement learning has one quite significant pitfall, which is the complexity of evaluating new environments, new action spaces, just adding a single action. Because, for example, if you're applying this to a computer networks of 100 nodes, every time you provide a new potential action an actor can take, that is 100 potential paths that you can go down, 100 routes that you have to simulate. When you get to the next step, you have to do that again for the 100 nodes again. So it's an exponential growth in the computational power that's required. Now, there's a large amount of research in the reinforcement learning space to identify how best we actually reduce the actions that are taken. The initial seeding, as I say, the action space, the agent has no knowledge as to what an action does. It only knows that it takes an action and that action has a positive outcome. That's all it knows about it. So it is not able, at least in the initial stages, to intuit that one action is better than another. So there's a lot of work around how can you seed it to, rather than do the entirely random, dumb actions that it may do in initial stages, actually take something that is inspired by human knowledge. The caveat being to that is that I mentioned that reinforcement learning is well known for cheating. Now, for us, that's really desirable because it means that reinforcement learning and similar systems will do things that humans don't do. It means we can do things that may be more efficient, that wouldn't occur to just the way the human brain thinks, and able to step outside the box and deal with issues in new and different ways. And yeah, I think the variety of actions and variety versus variety, it's challenging. So when we do these models, they are limited in what is computationally worthwhile including in the model. And it's also compounded by the likes of generative AI, where we can seed our action space with generative capabilities. So actually our action space doesn't have to be finite. It can be quite infinite in many regards. And exactly how we do that and how we rank different activities, there's a whole kind of bag of models and different approaches that we can take to making that more efficient, which we need to do more and more of. But yeah, hopefully that provides maybe not an answer, but some information of interest.
Thank you very much, John. And the technology did work, which was fantastic. I think we've got time for one more, and it's for Omar, please. You quoted this is from Trev Hilder, about new complexity beyond an individual, but this is surely not new. So you quoted Bar Yam about new complexity beyond an individual, but surely this is not new. question mark. The Afghans and Vietnamese have been using networks to defeat hierarchies for centuries.
Should I talk on here or should I?
Just talk to
Go on
me.
then. Okay, brilliant. But in order to answer that question, because it is a slightly radical claim, so to find my PowerPoint again. Oh my God, I'm going through all my work. Oh yeah, it's probably in the end. Yeah. Oh my God. Oh well, I'm done for. Anyways, this is what Yanir Baryam tries to do. Was to say a very specific point where complexity of human civilization, so the whole planet, is increasing because of the need to create more decentralized and network structures because others were doing it too. So it's kind of a dynamic, kind of like a game where you're in an environment, let's say 8000 BC, let's say early civilization, where I'm zooming in now. You would have a pharaoh, an emperor, a king. The complexity was extremely low. I'm making that radical claim because the way that society was organized was extremely hierarchical. An individual Roman marching, let's say, with his formation, could only do the behaviors equal to the complexity of that centurion, that general of that army. And the behaviors were very few. It was attack, defend, estudo, etc. That was also how societies were run, initially at least, in the Roman Republic, or the initial stages of the Persian Empire or the Yuan in China. You would have an emperor and you would have very controlled aspects of that local civilization. You're a farmer, you wake up at 8, you farm, you come back home. But because of communication technology and globalization, you get this trend towards more network forms of organization, or even network forms of interaction. I wouldn't even try to say there's some form of organization in some respects, in some areas. And so the example you give is the Vietnam War. That's a great example where you go back 100 years before, a US battalion could have taken over all of Vietnam because the Vietnamese were not able to be networked. This is how, Western colonialism worked so well. It was the overwhelming amount of force required.
Can you hear me?
Oh, hello.
Can you hear me? I'm the person who asked the question.
Yeah.
What I'm
We
making,
can hear you, Trevor.
is that the Vietnamese, the Chinese tried to conquer Vietnam, I think about 500 years ago, and they failed. So the Vietnamese knew how to see off a superpower 500 years ago. Then they saw off the French at Dien Bien Phu and so on. Then they saw off the Americans. But they've been doing this for 500 years. If you look at Afghanistan, they gave Alexander the Great a really hard time. It took the Arabs 100 years to conquer them in the 8th, 9th century. Some of these places got very sophisticated, but whilst apparently primitive, network capacity to defeat outsiders. The Afghans are known as the grave of empires. They saw off the British in 1842, did it again in the 1870s. They saw off the Soviet Union. They saw off the British, and so my contention is that some people have been doing this network stuff for a very, very long time indeed.
Oh, I see where you're coming from now. You'd be happy to know that I'm Afghan, so I've had a lot of enjoyment hearing you speak about all this.
Yeah. I'm a great fan of Ahmed Shah Massoud. He did amazing
Oh
things.
gosh, yes. Oh yes. Not a big fan of the other ones, obviously.
Not so much.
Yeah,
not so
Massoud was
much.
good.
Yeah.
I see where you're coming from now. I was looking at the perspective of what people are doing from ancient times till now would have a rudimentary form of network or complex system. But the claim here that Baryam is making is that that form of organization or form of networking interaction is increasing. So a good example is Napoleon. Conquered all of Europe, easy stuff. The moment he got into Spain, not so easy anymore. Not so easy at all. Hitler conquered all of Europe, could not win against their communist partisans in Yugoslavia or in Russia. The claim here isn't that it hasn't existed before. The claim here is that they're increasing in number and also increasing in, I want to be very careful here, but increasing in intensity. And a simple example to give with Vietnam is a really good example you gave because it actually shows the trajectory. The Chinese, when they first initially came here in Vietnam, they lost because of disease and the climate. But the French were able to conquer it quite easily until they lost in the 50s. That's when you start to see the Vietnamese employing technologies that were not apparent before and increase their abilities to have a network. And during the Vietnam War with the United States, they had a dual system. The North Vietnamese army, very hierarchical for large scale but low complexity interventions. But then you had the Viet Cong, which were highly networked and decentralized, using both together. Just to finish, my claim is, and Bariam's, is that these forms of organization are increasing everywhere. Online.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think they've always been there, but they're more prevalent than they used to be.
More prevalent here. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Trevor, thank you. Great question. Great answer, Omar. And you've brought us to a great finish. We've slightly overshot, ladies and gentlemen, but thank you very much for bearing with us. I'm going to give the last word to Pete, please, for closing. Pete, any particular reflections for today, please?
Obviously, to say thank you, everybody online, everybody organising, everybody presenting, very much so, but also that we're going to continue. So we are going to meet again. We'll be doing that in the normal Cybernetics live format. That will be to be confirmed, but June 18th will be the next one. And also we're going to publish something, and we're also going to try and create something like a Discord for gathering discussion around this theme. So more to come, and those who haven't spoken today, hope to hear from you in the future as we open the bandwidth on our own discussions. Thank you so much. Greatly appreciated. Keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Peter. Bye, Richard. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Moomin. Thank you.
Bye, Louis.
Bye.
That was lovely. Oh.
Bye, guys. Bye.
Bye. Yes, very much.